Welcome to the Plant Fit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Dr. Renae Thomas. Dr. Thomas is an international speaker, resident physician in one of the Blue Zone's Loma Linda, a board member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine Professionals in Training Division, and is also on the planning committee for the lifestyle track of the American College of Preventative Medicine. We start the conversation with Dr. Thomas sharing about how big an issue is cancer currently. Enjoy the presentation.
Everyone knows of cancer. I think everyone's heard of cancer. It does have a very strong fear emotion attached to it. But honestly, when you say how big is it, it's not really without valid reason that a lot of people are scared. I'm mostly familiar with statistics from the US, so I hope that's okay. But it's really the number 2 cause of death in United States adults. It has kind of flirted with being number 1. It kind of goes back and forth with cardiovascular disease. And sometimes that can depend if things like stroke are categorized with heart disease. So you're looking at the second leading cause of death. You're looking at over 1 million new diagnoses kind of each year, at least. Probably around 2,000 deaths per day in the United States from cancer. The kind of lifelong risks. Now, these sound a little scarier than they are, and I'll explain, but you are looking at about 1 in 3 women and about 1 in 2 men highly likely to develop cancer over their lifetime. Now, the disclaimer that comes with that is a lot of things, sometimes people will have cancer, but they may have it for many, many, many years, compared to other cancers that have a very rapid, kind of more scary diagnosis. So in saying that 1 in 2 men may develop it, something like prostate cancer for some men, they may have it for 15, 20 years. So that sounds super scary because everyone thinks, oh, that's what's going to happen to me. So sometimes it can sound a little exaggerated than it is, but that risk has been, pretty much validated in the United States. The sad part, really, and one of the reasons that I was so passionate about cancer and learning about it, was 1 in 9 people that survive their first cancer actually will develop a second. So that's where not only are we looking at preventive medicine, we're looking at then relapse prevention or recurrence prevention, or really just a sustained remission from the initial cancer. And then about 2 in 9 people that have a kind of like a primary cancer, then will develop a secondary kind of primary cancer as well, which honestly was something I was not that familiar with, even going to medical school. I thought that most people had the same cancer and it either came back or they had metastasis, but actually having a second primary cancer coming in as well. That's probably your biggest risk. So like I said, incidence rate, you're kind of looking at around 2 million somewhere between 1.7 to 2 million new cancer cases in the US per year. About 600,000 people dying from that every year.
Wow, second leading cause. And you mentioned there's a difference between men and male and female. So why is there that disparity?
It's about 1 in 2 men and about 1 in 3 female. That's kind of your lifetime risk factor. And I think a large percentage of that is actually the kind of the prevalence of prostate cancer. Obviously, women are immune from prostate cancer if they don't have a prostate. I do want to be sensitive of kind of a lot of the emerging way that people describe their genders or whatever gender they're recognizing as. But when we kind of talk about medical terms, this is kind of your biological sex. I guess if you want to refer to, in this particular case, of males being someone that has the prostate organ or prostate gland. And so I think that contributes significantly. Something like smoking rates tend to be higher in males than females. So again, that would increase your lung cancer risk. I'm pretty sure alcohol is a lot higher in men as well, which would increase, I'm pretty sure, let me just say that one more time. Alcohol, excess drinking, excess alcohol use tends to be higher in males, so that confers then a higher liver cancer risk. And then some of the stomach cancers, gallbladder cancers that are kind of associated with quite a meat-rich, heavy diet, and colon cancer, these tend to be, again, on a big population scale, males tend to consume more of those kind of red meat, heavy kind of fast foods than women. Women on average, and again, this is very, very, very general. We're talking about like countrywide statistics, not individuals, but women on average tend to eat healthier.
Where different cancers are concerned, you mentioned prostate, you mentioned colon cancer. Is there any difference, or are they quite similar in terms of how they progress?
I was kind of thinking about this before we talked, Luke. I know that you have very like highly educated listeners, but I do like to kind of explain cancer, because one of the things that's kind of interesting is, unlike some other disease processes that we learn about, cancer is still not entirely defined. There's a lot of theories and models of cancer, but it hasn't yet gotten to a point where there's a hard and fast, this is what cancer is and this is how we get it. And I think that's why it's kind of, I don't want to use the word controversial because it's not, but there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of funding, there's a lot of different protocols, a lot of different treatments and preventive methods, because it's just not that well understood yet. When we know 100% the cause, the risk factors, this, that, and the other, it's very easy then to create prevention and treatment. And so an example of that was when the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer was discovered. By never smoking a cigarette, your risk of lung cancer is drastically reduced. So when you have kind of clear-cut cause and effect, and I know I said we don't have a cause and effect for cancer, but that's just an example of one that is very strongly correlated, the kind of treatment is similar. So what I was kind of getting at that I think is helpful is to kind of even think about what even is cancer and what are we thinking in terms of the most current theories. So cancer is very serious. And so I do want to say sometimes I kind of laugh and joke, but it's more to make it more interesting than a medical textbook. I hope it is not offensive to anyone. But I know when I was younger, I definitely thought that cancer was kind of like this, other body that was coming in. It was like a disease that was coming into the body and it was infecting whatever part of the body. And that's kind of how a lot of medicine was thought of for many, many years. And a lot of that then even, more, it became even more believed when we learned about like bacterial infections, for example. But cancer, kind of unbeknownst to a lot of people, and definitely myself when I was younger, it's actually not something that has come into you or infected you. It's actually, at least the most broadly accepted theories at the moment is that it's more an abnormal growth of actually your own body cells. So, every organ or body part is made up of cells, and these really have certain kind of defined lifespans. They have lots and lots of regulatory systems in place for their cell division, their replication, their damage repair, and kind of this programmed death cycle, so that we don't have cells just living in our body indefinitely. And this programmed death really does occur either with age, but it also can happen when the cell may, replicate incorrectly or it divides wrong, especially in terms of its DNA. There might be just too many mistakes or it's just too damaged to be repaired by the repair mechanisms. And then so these external factors that we kind of discuss in terms of cancer, as they're assumed to kind of cause cell damage or mutation, these are kind of at rates that are assumed to overwhelm this system. And so they allow mutated or abnormal cells that would normally be kind of programmed to die by the body. They actually end up growing, dividing, replicating. And that's when we start to get tumor growth or things that we would recognize to be cancer or precancerous cells. And so because these cells are already now abnormal, they tend to kind of develop further mutations along the way. And a lot of these have to do with growth, metabolism, replication and division, and then this kind of programmed cell death or apoptosis. And so this then allows these particular abnormal cells to grow at a much more rapid rate, often relatively differently or faster, or just in a very weird, hard to recognize kind of form than the original cell type. So for example, on a biopsy or something like that, a cancer looks very different to the original cell. So if I took, say, a skin sample that I thought maybe there was skin cancer, it's very easily, you can look under the microscope and it does not look like the original skin cell. And so these kind of mutations that they develop, in particular, ones that we learn about, things like tumor suppressor genes, they get switched off or downregulated, which means that cells and regulatings and genes and systems that usually work in the body to kind of suppress abnormal cell growth, they're downregulated and minimized. And then in addition, at the same time, things that are called proto-oncogenes, or kind of genes that regulate abnormal cell growth, they're actually upregulated. So you can see kind of what would stop them growing gets downgraded, what would let them grow gets upregulated, and these abnormal cells can often flourish. And that's when we have you start to see the clinical signs and symptoms of someone that has cancer.
You mentioned replicating, Dr. Thomas. So maybe you could share with the audience what contributes to these, I would call them rogue cells or cancerous cells replicating.
This is where there is so much research, and this is so multifactorial. There is just a huge amount of information. But I think what would be most useful, Luke, to talk about kind of in line with your summit is what we are kind of more learning about is the contribution from things that are perhaps not genetic. So, a lot of people think that cancer is just a genetic predetermined disease. And what we're finding out, and these kind of what I'm going to share with is not my personal opinion alone. This is by, the American Institute for Cancer Research. A lot of these really big cancer organizations are kind of sharing this information as well. And they really think that somewhere between about 10%, maybe up to 30% of cancers are from such genetic causes. And we do see these, and a lot of the time they're early onset, they're very rapidly progressive, or you just see them in everyone in the family. And these can be particularly sad and nasty because they are genetic. So there's not a lot the person can do. I'm sure there's a level of prevention and maybe delaying, but it is one of those things that's a little more predetermined. But the good news is these are a very small majority, unlike kind of a commonly accepted idea that they're the majority. So that leaves us honestly with somewhere between about 60, 70 to 90% of cancers really believed to be preventable in the United States. If you kind of calculate that out, we're talking like 700,000 cases of cancer per year, just in the United States alone, let alone the rest of the world. And so that's what we bring up, what would be kind of referred to as controllable cancer risk factors. And this is very, very, very broad. Relevant to your summit, nutrition and physical activity are huge. I particularly like nutrition, and not just because I find it interesting, but really diet is a major multiple times per day, like environmental exposure. It varies greatly between individuals, and dietary factors, therefore, have been kind of a good focus of extensive study. Obviously, being in Loma Linda and the Loma Linda Adventist Health Studies have a huge focus on cancer because we have a population here that eats very differently to the rest of the United States on average. And they also have significantly different and most of the time significantly lower risks, prevalence, and incidence of cancer.
If we talk about nutrition, and of course, you mentioned earlier about processed meat. So, and I've remembered seeing that processed meat is class 1, and then red meat is class 2. So if we look at it as on a kind of macro perspective, how does meat or animal protein contribute to cancer? What mechanisms contribute to it?
If you don't mind, if I share a little background information first, because I think it's helpful to think about cancer prevention in kind of a stratified risk factors. And I think that a lot of people, actually the general public, became aware when, like you say, processed meat came out as what we would call a class 1 carcinogen. And I think that was probably the first time that kind of classing or, this stratification of risk that we have with cancer was really kind of fed into mainstream media. So you're exactly right, Luke. And so we use the National Cancer Institute is probably one of the big ones. And then going into, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, and then the World Health Organization, they kind of collaborate together and they create monographs that identify carcinogenic or cancer causing, cancer promoting hazards. And this does include food, and they are broken down into these kind of group 1 or class 1. So group 1 is what we would call known carcinogens. And this is where they've determined, these are big agencies, the International Agency for Research on Cancer and World Health Organization. These are huge research agencies. They feel that these particular elements, some of them are food, some of them environmental exposures, many things, they really feel like there's sufficient evidence that these can cause cancer or have carcinogenicity in humans. And they recommend to really minimize intakes, preferably avoid these wherever possible. So things that they would include, it does include, like you said, very recently, they added the processed red meat, but kind of other things to think about, excessive alcohol intake. They actually just put alcohol in general of any amount as a class 1 carcinogen, which is kind of mind-blowing to most people. They say that there's zero safe intake for cancer prevention. Other things that would come in, things like arsenic, people have probably heard of, but unfortunately that is in a lot of the food contaminated from water. It can be in a lot of some animal feed, particularly pigs, can actually have arsenic in their feed. A lot of chemicals fall into this category, but things like benzene that might be in soft drink. What else do we have that's really common? I'm trying to think of things that people would have heard of. Nickel, heavy metals. Then we kind of have the group that people know some of these acronyms, like because they're in plastic. So things like dioxins, dioxin-like compounds, PCBs, POPs, a lot of these then as well. And this is kind of getting into where does the meat situation come in. A lot of these are what we would call bioaccumulated, biomagnified, and bioamplified, which basically, to simplify that, means the higher you eat up the food chain, the more concentrated they get. So sure, a lot of these chemicals are sprayed on food, and a lot of people think, oh, I have to eat organic. And of course, that's going to minimize the intake. But unfortunately, the runoff can also go other places. But then these are then fed to animals. And so then those chemicals can be, so a lot of these chemicals are fat soluble. So animal products have a lot more fat in them than plant foods. So it gets stored in the body fat and often in between the muscle. And so it's not just a matter of cutting the fat off, unfortunately. So these kind of get concentrated in the animal product. And so the dose that the human eating such foods would get a much higher dose than if they had eaten the plant product. So that's kind of where that came from. Also going along kind of that processed red meat. So any high temperature frying of meat, and then that can create things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, especially when it's over about 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is meat, fish, and poultry cooked that high. The Aussie in me cooking over an open flame, making a barbecue falls into this category. And then the processing of meat. So that includes the high temperature required to process the meat, whether it's salted, whether it's cured, whether it's fermented, whether it's smoked. And then a lot of the nitrite and nitrate-based preservatives that go into the meats. And then that's kind of like your really solid evidence. Then these are all listed. This, again, not my opinion. You can find it listed on their website. These are the known carcinogens that they have listed, and many of those are included in processed meats of all types, not just processed red meat, and that's why processed meats are all listed there. Kind of more emerging evidence for that then goes into things like heme iron, the amines and amides, and nitroso compounds, which are kind of intrinsic in animal flesh.
I won't repeat that word. Again, I'll just say PAHS, PAS, and heterocyclic amines. I can say that one.
I'm like, who volunteered to talk on cancer? Seriously, I can't pronounce these words.
Well, it's okay. We'll abbreviate it. PAHs and heterocyclic amines. So those like two aspects are present in heated meat products. So for example, if we take tofu, or if we want to take like a process of Beyond Meat or Impossible or any fake meats, by heating it up on, for example, on a barbecue or grilling it, and as you would on the barbecue, would those compounds be actually present on these plant-based protein alternatives?
Things like tofu, tempeh, your very kind of more minimally processed meat alternatives, beans, of course, like those kind of products. The amino acid content is quite drastically different to meat, especially in terms of the kind of amides, amines. And so when they are cooked at high heat, charring in general is actually considered, it's listed on the carcinogen list. So I probably wouldn't recommend charring any of your food, but cooking over 400 degrees Fahrenheit of any plant food has not been found to form these compounds in the ones that have been studied. Now, you raise a good point, Luke. A lot of these new products have not been studied for whether they produce these substances or not. I do have some concerns personally, and whilst I think it's great to see plant-based eating and the plant-based movement grow for many aspects, especially environmental and ethical. But from a medical standpoint, I don't really know if we have the evidence of safety of these foods, especially when I hear things like artificial heme being created, knowing that when these nitrates and nitrites combined with the heme ion, they do form these compounds. So anything that has that kind of nitrate, heme ion, amines, amides, nitroso compounds, this is kind of the intrinsic amino acid type content of animal flesh used for food. That's just not present in a lot of these unrefined plant-based foods. But I think there's a gray zone between some of the more newer, more processed meat alternatives that I'm just not sure what they are putting in all of them and whether they would contain the same products. I've never seen a study that has found it, but I wouldn't want to say definitely no, because I just don't know what's in all of the products.
And you're right, because with a lot of these new products, it's only time will tell what the impact is, because as they start flooding the market. So I want to kind of zip back to
Sure.
cancer and causes of cancer, and more on a personal note as well, because my brother actually passed away about in March a few months ago for stomach cancer. Yeah, so it was tough. It was tough, and I know many people are impacted by cancer, whether themselves or their family members. So when you go to a medical professional, a doctor, and they give you that sentence, almost like a death sentence, like, all right, you have 6 months to live. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's definitely nothing I learned at medical school, but having talked and worked with a lot of oncologists, I don't think anyone can deny the power of a positive attitude and thinking, having that will to live, really motivated to do whatever you can to get well, to stay strong. I really do think it goes a long way. I've seen a lot of people, I work at a faith-based institute, but a lot of people that have a lot of faith in God that they're going to survive do seem to do a little better. And it's kind of interesting to see, as well as those that are just like, nope, this will not get me. Like, I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to survive. I've got things to do. Don't get me wrong. Unfortunately, it's not foolproof, but I think there's something to be said for that. Now, I do tend to be a very kind of step back, hands-off physician. I don't like to make strong recommendations to people, because I feel my role is more to educate, to kind of tell you, well, this is the research, this is what we know, this study says this study says this, perhaps if you did this could happen versus this. And then I kind of want to take a step back and say, go and read this, go and do this, have a think about it, talk to your friends, your family, and then come back and tell me what resonates with you. Because at the end of the day, it's not my job, I don't feel, to make those decisions for people. And I know this has been a shift in medicine. It used to be very kind of patriarchal, like the doctor says do this and you'll do this. Like, I know that's how it kind of came about. But I feel like a lot of, I guess, like new wave, physicians like me, I don't want to be telling people what to do. I want to kind of guide them to make their own decisions. And I think that can sometimes, my thoughts kind of to answer your question, I think that for anyone, and I say this to everyone that gets a diagnosis with cancer, go and get a second opinion, get a third opinion, get a fourth opinion. And my dad, having had cancer, says that to everyone as well. And I know he did that. Really find someone that's telling you something that resonates with you. Now, don't get me wrong, there's definitely those outlier people that have seen 27 doctors and haven't got the answer that they want. I'm not saying that, if everyone's saying you have 6 months to live, you're going to find someone that says you have 60 years, probably not. But definitely finding someone that you at least feel comfortable with, that you feel like they're explaining things to you, understand the process, you're understanding your options, and you also feel free to make the decisions that resonate with you. That's kind of where I try to fit in. I personally try almost never to make predictions on dates. We do that with babies, and we can't even predict that, knowing that it's going to be somewhere on average between 36 and 42 weeks. And I can't even get that right. So who knows how I'm going to predict how long someone has to live with cancer. I usually just say to people, like, you have this diagnosis. We know a lot of people get well. Unfortunately, some people have a very long struggle. Some people have a very short struggle. And some people, unfortunately, don't make it through this struggle. It's not their time. I would, like any time, whether you're perfectly well or you have cancer, I would recommend living your life to the fullest, because we never know. You could be diagnosed with cancer given 6 months and, I don't mean to be morbid, but step in front of a car by accident and be killed today. We just don't know how short we will be on this world. Life is so valuable that I just recommend, wherever possible, live your life to the fullest. try not to think about the cancer, I guess, do all the things you can do. But yeah, I do worry about that. I've heard a lot of people, like you say, just anecdotally, but like die exactly on their 6-month date. And that doesn't make sense from a cancer perspective. I don't know. I'm not an oncologist by any means. I just have a very personal interest in cancer, especially the nutritional aspect. I don't think that we have tools that are that accurate yet to predict your exact, like, how long you have to live. I think we have good estimates. And I think that that can be important to share with some people, especially if they ask, because I think that's one of the most common questions, especially from the family, is like, doctor, how long do I have left? So I think it's helpful to give a suggestion, being a rather large window, like as large as I possibly know is actually accurate. So if I know it's somewhere between 1 month and 2 years, I'm not going to average that and say you've got a year. I'm going to say, look, for some people, unfortunately, this can be as short as a month. It can be 2 years. And we have medical miracles that recover from this. This, you know, I'm talking if it's a really poor, like a very progressive cancer, let's say something like esophageal cancer or pancreatic cancer. They're kind of particularly unpleasant diagnoses to give to people. You know, they often can be very short. But I will always say, look, statistically speaking, the odds are not good. We always have medical outliers. I recommend that you think like that may be you, but also have the reality that it may not. So make sure everything's in order, but also don't just be like counting down your days.
Taking second opinions, and also it's just your mindset towards everything and doing everything within your power to help the body heal on many levels. So I guess where you know, the next step really where cancer a diagnosis is concerned for people, say the doctor doesn't give the time frame or anything like that, then the next step would be, all right, what kind of treatment protocols that are open to them, you know? And sometimes they say, all right, well, it's really only chemo or surgery. So and then on the other side, if you get a second opinion, there might be people who say, well, you might want to try water fasting, juice fasting, go to somewhere like True North. What's your take on that?
Yeah, you know, you've asked kind of the big question, and obviously it's hard, because I think that cancer has almost like blown up into being, you know, I've seen all kinds of things where, you know, the medicine is, you know, I've seen the advertisements in the United States, but, you know, sometimes it's advertised like cure all this kind of cancer, like, you know, you're cured, you'll never be sick again. And then we see almost like the complete other side that, you know, big pharma is the devil, doctors want to kill you, you know, don't do anything. And I feel like the truth maybe lies somewhere in between the two. And that's where I think the opinions come in. And that's where, but you know, I'm going to say this with my own personal bias, because I saw my dad go through it. He had traditional medical treatment, but also completely revolutionized his lifestyle, and he incorporated alternative medicine at the same time. Now, of course, this is something you definitely need to talk to whichever doctor you're going with. I think there's something to be said to have an open mind, to look at the research, to understand all the pros and cons, and to maybe even avoid that black and white mindset that we do see. Some people think, well, if I'm going to do the traditional way, I just have to do that. You know, I'm just going to have chemo. I'm just going to have radiation. I'm just going to have surgery. Doesn't matter what I eat, or, you know, doesn't matter if I exercise. And then on the other side, like you say, you may have someone that's going to go and juice fast and do everything alternative. And there's actually a really sad study that didn't have great outcomes. Now, it may be biased. A lot of studies are biased, but that kind of made me a little nervous. So I don't know. I've seen all kinds, you know, I did my internship at True North. I've seen all kinds of medical miracles there, including cancer regression for that case of lymphoma that they published. I've seen all kinds of things happen there that I never thought were possible. It's the whole reason I went there. I heard him talk when I was in medical school, and I was a little skeptical. And this is someone that's, you know, I see myself generally as pretty open-minded and very open to learn about alternative medicine and other kind of fields of medicine, other countries' types of medicine. But True North just seemed a little bit too much to believe. And so going there, I truly say that everything that they talked about was 100% true. But it was nothing I learned in medical school. So what do I think? You know, I kind of, again, I don't want to have a strong opinion, but I think that people just it's their life, and the cancer diagnosis shouldn't change who they are as a person. I would hate for someone to be forced into something. The biggest problem that is really, really hard, and I have this on a daily struggle, is what, you know, in medicine, we're really moving away from, like I was talking about, that patriarchal model to what we would call informed consent. Now, it's not to insult a patient. It's not to insult anyone's intelligence. But a lot of the, you know, I have been at school for over 10 years. It's really hard to condense that information and really relay, cause, effect, mechanism, the biology, the this, the that, all the treatment options, all the side effects, all of those in what a lot of the time is, I don't know, a 20-minute visit. And it's like there's only so much research and understanding that can come without having that training. And that's where a lot of people come in and they start being like, well, I'm the doctor, I'm going to tell you. So a big part for me is really trying to figure out how to relay information, relay like the real actual statistics of all the different types of treatments of cancer, alone or separate, and really then have the person understand, so that even if perhaps the choice that they make is not what I would recommend medically, at the end of the day, that's their choice, not mine. And as long as they really do, and I feel like they really do understand what I'm saying, then and hopefully they've seen other people and they really understand all of their options. If they choose not to do something, it's not really my job, I don't feel, to tell them that they're wrong.
So I wanna kind of also look at myths of cancer.
Okay.
Certain myths of cancer. What are the top myths? And I think we had a conversation just before about the notion that cancer feeds off sugar. So and that was in my experience. During my brother's diagnosis and treatment, he went through different modalities of healing. And what I learned through the process was cancer feeds off sugar. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think it's important, and that's why I kind of wanted to, at the beginning, kind of break down what we at least believe, the most accepted models of cancer really are, because that answers that question. So actually, nearly every cell in our body runs off sugar. And so when we understand that cancer is a mutated version of our own cells, well, of course it runs off sugar, because every cell in our body runs off sugar pretty much. There's a few kind of exceptions, but things like the brain are almost exclusively running off sugar unless we become starved or ketogenically adapted. That's kind of the preferred source, and it all kind of fuels to the brain. But the majority of our body, when given the preference, will run off sugar. Now, I'm not saying like white table sugar like we all think, but every form of carbohydrate and a lot of the actual proteins that we consume will then break down into those kind of, protein doesn't break down into glucose that the body would run off, but the amino acids can feed into pathways that form glucose. So really glucose, or what comes from sugar, table sugar is glucose and fructose, but let's just call it glucose for simplicity, breaking down from all the carbohydrates. Like I say, it really does run every cell in the body. Now, where does this, sugar feeds cancer? Well, like I said, of course, because it feeds every cell, but cancer cells, because of their mutations and their rapid dividing and they kind of rapidly mutate, they rapidly replicate, they don't die, and they just form these kind of like hypermetabolic tumors a lot of the time. They consume the fuel or the sugar at a much more rapid rate to other cells in the body, just because of their demand. Like, they're doing a lot more than the rest of the cells. It's kind of like saying, if you were to go, Luke, tomorrow, maybe your partner instead of you, but go run a marathon, right? Or an ultra marathon. Like, your sugar demands doing that, or your glucose demands, are so much higher than me laying on the couch doing an interview. Right? So it's kind of the same with cancer. Cancer is like exercising at highest intensity all day long. And that's why it needs so much. Or you can liken it to maybe a child that's rapidly growing. Like, every cell in a kid's body is just rapidly turning over. And that's why kids' metabolisms on average are much higher than adults. So that's where, and then it kind of came into thinking about it that way, using things like PET scans, where we actually use a glucose tracer to figure out where cancer is in the body. Now, I don't want to completely butcher it because there's so many different tests now, but I definitely know that glucose tracers or sugar tracers are used to highlight where cancer can be in the body, because that rapid division shows up as rapid consumption of the glucose tracer. Now, how does that then correlate to diet? That is the challenging part that I really don't think we know the answer yet. I would love to, kind of figure that out. Because the thing is then what we're thinking, okay, so exactly what you're talking about. If we say, okay, cancer needs glucose to grow, and often it loses some of the other adaptations that lets them use other substrates. Often some cancers become very dependent on glucose. So it makes sense then, let's never eat carbohydrates. Let's never eat any sugar. That makes sense, right? But you're kind of forgetting, and this is one of the biggest problems with finding treatments for cancer, is so does every other cell in your body. So if you stop eating the sugar, you need to find another fuel for the rest of your body. And that's where kind of a lot of these other low carbohydrate diets and things have come in. But the human body, really in the absence of starvation, really just likes to try and find a way to produce glucose as it is. And then that would be rapidly kind of shuttled to the cancer cells. I think the evidence is emerging of whether we can stop that. I would love to see kind of in vitro, in vivo studies, or like in a petri dish in humans, and see if it really does make a difference. My concern, obviously going back to everything we're kind of talking about with things that we know, as in, this is all speculative and new research. Going back to kind of solid research that we know is a lot of the foods that people are replacing these kind of plant-based, higher carbohydrate foods. We're talking red meats, we're talking high-fat diets, all these things that we know really do promote the growth of cancer. So it's kind of between a rock and a hard place. Like, I think that it's emerging. There's probably someone that knows a lot more about this particular question than I do, but I don't think it's as simple as sugar feeds cancer, let's not eat sugar.
Maybe we could also now look at fat, if that's something that you have research on, or your experience on how this fat, because we're on the Plant Fit Summit, and a lot of the doctors that I've spoken to advocate a low fat, whole foods, plant-based diet, so versus a keto diet. So does fat actually contribute to cancer growth in any way or not?
The American Cancer Society has really come out and said that they support the American Heart Association's recommendation to really include at absolute maximum kind of saturated fat to be about 5 to 6% of calories at most. And they actually put out no safe limit for trans fats, which is going back to the saturated fat, we kind of talk about a standard 2,000 calorie diet. I never really recommend counting calories personally, but if you are, or like you have a rough idea what that is, it's really about 13 grams of saturated fat per day, which isn't a lot for kind of the typical American diet or the typical Western diet. The average consumption of saturated fat in the United States is more than double that. It's about 27 grams per day, or about kind of 11 to 15% of this kind of 2,000 calorie diet. Now, if you're eating even more than that, it's even higher. They also do recommend, actually, what you were saying with a lot of the plant-based doctors, the American Cancer Society does recommend a diet low in overall total fat from all sources as well. They define it as about 20 to 30% of your total caloric intake. And this is really because high-fat diets have been associated with increased cancer risk, particularly colon cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer, endometrial cancer, lung cancer, possibly breast cancer, especially postmenopausal breast cancer. And so this really comes from the association between high-fat diets and kind of systemic inflammation. And we see this contributing to a lot of other disease, of course, heart disease being one of them. Cardiovascular disease is the more broader term. Insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is almost a no-brainer with high-fat diets. But we also see, and now this is a lot of acronyms and terms, but systemic inflammation, let's kind of break it down a little bit. We get you'll see an elevated white cell count in a lot of these people, because that's what happens when we have inflammation or infection. And then a lot of these kind of signaling pathways, if you read a little bit of research on cancer, you'll see things like NF-kappa beta is a really common one that's thrown out there. And some of these are targets for chemotherapy as well and cancer treatments, but you'll kind of see a lot of these coming out. P13K is another pathway, beta-catenin signaling. What's the other one? Kind of like a myofibroblast differentiation, that's in breast cancer. And we kind of see these are kind of like cell pathways that increase the cancer risk, is basically what I'm trying to say. And the high-fat diet, basically, so if you imagine like a diagram, you have your high-fat diet, your systemic inflammation, these kind of inflammatory markers, and then increased risk of particular cancers. And the diagram that I use all the time that I'm kind of trying to draw in the air, but that one was for liver cancer, intestinal cancers, and gastric cancers, and breast cancer, really showing that correlation between the two. And then that's kind of where a lot of that research has come from. Ovarian cancers have been pretty, like, there's a fair few studies associating that with higher saturated fat intake. There's actually a pretty recent randomized control clinical trial that used a low-fat dietary intervention to reduce the incidence of ovarian cancer. And compared to the control group, when people had the highest fat intake from animal foods compared, they had about a 30% increased risk in ovarian cancer compared to those that were eating the lowest amount of fats from animal products. Endometrial cancer, kind of similar pattern, increased saturated fat, especially in those that kind of, if they also had excess circulating estrogen, whether that be from birth control or from excess body fat producing it, that was really one of the main contributing factors they found in endometrial cancer.
So endometrial cancer, and then there's ovarian cancer as well. For women, the big one is breast cancer. So, where breast cancer is concerned, some people say you should scan, other people say no, don't scan. So what's your take on going for a mammogram?
Yeah, definitely a controversial one, especially with, I think Canada was a few years ago, was actually took that out of your screening. This is the annual screening guidelines. So I work in the United States, so in line with I always make a mistake with this acronym. US, I want to say like USTSPF. It's something along those lines. It's like United States Task of Preventive Services or something along those lines. They recommend, annual breast cancer screening once you reach the age of, age appropriate screening. And then you often start that a little earlier if there's symptoms. So, it's hard for me to ever have a strong opinion as a medical provider of whether you should or shouldn't do something, especially when that's the preventive guidelines. So I kind of, again, going back to what I was saying before, and I'm not trying to dodge a bullet with answering any questions when people ask me, but it's like, okay, this is the recommendation by this big agency, and this is the reasons why, this is the potential benefits, this is the potential harms. And then we talk about other things. If someone comes in and they have something very obvious that, especially if it externally looks like cancer, or you're feeling it and it very much feels like cancer, of course, that's something you need to screen. I would be very concerned if someone didn't want to do that. You're talking more about the mammograms, and it's hard when we then know that some of the exposures of radiation can increase the risk of cancer. So it's kind of a tough one. We know that early diagnosis and treatment does reduce the risk, especially in breast cancer. Now, there are some cancers, thyroid cancer being one of them, where early diagnosis often doesn't make a difference. And that came out of, I think it was a Korean study. It was definitely kind of like a Australasian, Asian type country that put it out there. And they said that screening for thyroid cancer made no difference on survival. The PSA and prostate cancer has become the new one where we're really not even doing it anymore because the screening didn't have any benefit on the survival time, but also the interventions that then come. So, your PSA is elevated from a screening test. So then, of course, the more you look, the more you find. But the next step then would be, you're getting biopsies, you're getting more invasive kind of diagnostic tests. I've had people I've sent for a mammogram, for example, that have had to have 4 or 5 afterwards because it looks abnormal. So they need a different angle or they need a different type. And, 5 mammograms down there, they say, oh, it's normal. And that can be very overwhelming. That whole period of time is very stressful for the person. And then going back to what I was talking about with prostate cancer, sometimes the early treatment for prostate cancer can really give a quality of life that isn't considered acceptable for a lot of people, given that the actual absolute benefit wasn't huge in terms of survival for certain stages. Of course, there's, cancer is just such a broad topic that I don't want to go into too much detail of any particular thing. But yeah, mammograms, again, very tough one. I would, really just go through all the risks and benefits. But the reason I used the prostate cancer example was the research behind breast cancer screening, being that early diagnosis and early treatment really does have a huge impact statistically on survival time, risk of, recurrence, lots of things like that. So that's why it's really up there with one of the highest screening things. There's not that many tests that we recommend on an annual basis, for especially screening for cancer. Things like colonoscopy are every 10 years. In comparison, you're not getting a mammogram every 10 years. And that's because there are some breast cancers in particular that can have very fast growth. Even people that have what we would call interval growth, which is where they have a negative mammogram and then 6 months later they develop symptoms, and because of that we would do a diagnostic mammogram, not a screening mammogram, and they have cancer, and it was not picked up on the first one because it was so rapidly progressing. So I can understand, and I can see a lot of it. I don't have a strong opinion. I'm very much for informed consent. Do I think there's better options? Do I wish there were better options? Definitely. In younger women, they're pretty inaccurate. A breast ultrasound is much more accurate because of the firmness of the breasts, but mammogram is more the standard. Even some of the insurance companies, you have to do a mammogram first before you can even order an ultrasound. And it's kind of frustrating because the mammogram comes back sometimes saying, breasts are too firm. I'm like, I know, that's why I ordered an ultrasound, but insurance wanted me to do the mammogram first. So things like that, I don't think that's fair to the patient. I don't think that's good care. But sometimes we are held to kind of struggles of coverage and this, that, and the other. I honestly do not have a strong opinion. I definitely lean towards if there's a strong family history, if there's this or there's that. Do I think in someone that's otherwise healthy, no family history of any of the type of female hormone cancers, because they're often related. So that would be, like your ovarian, your endometrial, your cervical, your breast cancer, any of those cancers. If there's no family history, you're otherwise well, especially if you're kind of at the younger end of it. If you really wanted to push it to 2 years, if you wanted to wait a little longer, as long as you understand that some people, and you never know who that person's going to be, some people do have very rapidly progressing breast cancer. And that's hard. It's hard because we don't know who that person is going to be. I wish there was better ways to predict that. If I knew someone was going to be that person, I would be scanning them every 6 months, let's catch it. Because if I knew they had a very high risk. Other people, if I had a way of knowing their risk was super low, maybe we could push it out. Maybe we never had to do it. There's a lot of people that never get breast cancer, but unfortunately, because the rate of breast cancer, especially in the United States, is so high, and we kind of have a lot of evidence that getting the screening or picking it up, diagnosing it early, really does lead to much better survival rates. That's why it's so heavily recommended.
You've shared a lot on the mechanisms of cancer and, of course, nutrition as well. So there is this mindset of the war on cancer. The medical industry is, at war with this foreign entity, cancer. Is there anything wrong with that approach or that paradigm?
I think that really just takes us back to the original part when we have, the biggest cancer research industries. The American Institute for Cancer Research, World Health Organization, international cancer researchers, all of these big organizations that, if you want to buy into the war on cancer or the cancer conspiracy, these are the companies that are there that could potentially make huge amounts of profit. And that's what people think, right? That's the commonly accepted thing. I'm not going to pretend I haven't heard these things before. These are the big companies that could profit off this, right? They are the ones that are coming out and saying that 70 to 90% of these cancers are preventable by lifestyle choices and environmental changes. It just doesn't make sense to me that, people are so suspicious when they're saying that. They're not saying no, this is your destiny, you have to come and get medical treatment. They're like, no, you can prevent a lot of this. And then also, the American Cancer Research, they put out things for prevention. They put out things for relapse prevention, and they're mostly lifestyle. They're, physical activity, they're good nutrition, stress management, all of these kind of things they know. They put out great information about it. So honestly, I think it's great that we have medical treatment, but for me, it's often a last resort or just a tool in the toolbox of everything else that we have.
As a takeaway, I'd like to leave the audience with a takeaway piece. So you mentioned nutrition a fair bit. So maybe you could share the one-on-one on, cancer prevention through nutrition particularly. And maybe you could even recommend some specific foods, because some people like to have, for example, more turmeric, more garlic, or whatever it is. Maybe what are your recommendations?
So I think that becoming really familiar with those IARC, or International Agency for Research on Cancer, they're monographs that really point out the foods and other things in your lifestyle that are either known or highly likely to cause cancer, or at least to increase your risk. That's how they more put it out. They don't say it's going to cause it. They just say it's going to substantially increase your risk. Familiar yourself with these things. Familiar yourself with then big studies that look at dietary patterns. So obviously Adventist Health Study is huge for me being in Loma Linda, but there are other big scale studies that look at what are people doing in their life, where are pockets of higher rates of cancer, where, what are people doing that are getting particular cancers, how are they eating, and looking at these kind of patterns. And it, spoiler alert, it's very different to the standard Western diet. The kind of, the foods that we're looking at, all these like kind of processed, multicolored, fast food, deep fried, meat heavy, like that's kind of not doing so well in studies that then compare it to things like whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, which really makes up maybe 10% of the American diet. And about 50% of that by definition is French fries and, tomato ketchup. But kind of going into what you were talking about. So that would be, I would recommend looking at those lists for those really solid evidence, then looking at the patterns, and then we can kind of get into the food. So foods that kind of constantly come up in a lot of cancer research. Let's go with the kind of reducing side. That would be your animal products. And it really does pertain to all kinds of meat, poultry, fish, dairy, eggs, basically anything that was once alive or came from something that was alive, as an animal source. Looking at some of the environmental toxins and trying to reduce like overall toxic load, whether that be from chemicals in your environment, pesticides and things on the food, living in a healthy air quality environment, not smoking, not drinking alcohol. I just took away probably everyone's fun things in life. And then we go into really, what are the protective things? What is evidence showing are the things that we want to focus on? And that's where we start to get into, it's a little more positive. We're looking at foods of plant-based origin. We're looking at as many fruits and vegetables in as many colors as we can get, really just cramming the day. There's so many phytochemicals or like plant metabolites that really actually have, and pretty provenly so, cancer preventive effects in their antioxidant qualities. They really reduce that oxidative stress that I was talking about before, or systemic inflammation, and also can help prevent some of that damage to DNA and really protecting those cells from the mutations we were talking about earlier. Things that come up, fiber. Fiber is only found in plant foods, one of the biggest protective factors against colon cancer. Whole grains, again, just so many great studies about eating whole grains, eating legumes or beans or any of those kind of products. Of course, fruits and vegetables are just a no-brainer in general, but lots of specific ones, your real brightly colored ones. The American Institute for Cancer Research actually has a list of foods that fight cancer, and it just goes through a ton of the benefits of all different types of fruits and vegetables. There is I'm scared to say it on your podcast, Luke, sorry, on your summit, but, phytoestrogens and soy and ligands and flax seeds and that kind of thing actually really do have a lot of really good evidence. Now, I know some of it is mixed. I know it's a very controversial topic, so let's just skim over that one. But there is a lot of great supportive evidence, especially when these foods are consumed from childhood. It seems to be when it's a lifelong pattern, as we see in a lot of traditional Asian diets, and when it's in its unprocessed form. So we're not having highly processed soy that's deep fried, that's maybe eaten as a, McSoy nugget or something. Like, it's very different to people that are growing up eating edamame, they're eating tofu, they're eating tempeh, and basically any other kind of beans. A lot of that kind of, again, reducing systemic inflammation, increasing overall health will help with that, reducing a lot of the risk factors that come with a less than ideal diet. So things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, kind of associated with that obviously will make a huge difference, because it's kind of the carry-on effect to cancer risk. Herbs and spices have a lot of evidence. I don't, everyone wants to know, like, what's the food? Like, if I have turmeric, will I live forever? But, there are a list of them. I probably don't want to read them because I have a list like this that have been studied, but I would just recommend to anyone, any herbs, spices that you like, eat as many as you can. Same with fruits and vegetables. So, one of the things I really try and do that I think would be a great takeaway, as you were talking about, when I kind of go through the research and when I'm talking about, how do we then think about what to do on a daily basis? Like, the amount of evidence is just overwhelming. Like, what does it even look like? And so one of the things I've been working on with, people at Loma Linda is we've been trying to come up with what we call like a nutritional prescription instead of, your kind of standard prescription that you would give out. And so I can share with you kind of what we came up with, the basics of what we did for cancer, if you'd like. So we kind of talked about focusing on whole food, plant-based nutrition. Now, as this term's become more popular, it's kind of been a little diluted or changed around a little bit, but we kind of talk about, food in its whole form. So it's recognizable. So a carrot looks like a carrot. For example, brown rice versus say rice pasta or something like that. It's kind of as grown. There can be minimal processing. Of course, some foods are inedible otherwise. And then we try to avoid any additions of salt, oil, sugar, flour, and of course, alcohol, as we mentioned, and including really high sodium things. So things like soy sauce, broths, any kind of natural refined sugars or sweeteners like maple syrup, honey, and then kind of all oils. They're all very highly processed. Yes, even extra virgin olive oil. And that's really just to get as much fiber as you can get in, as much vitamins, minerals, complex carbohydrates, these real kind of plant-based foods that we need, the phytochemicals, the antioxidants, phytoestrogens, omega-3 and 6 essential fatty acids, really just focusing on consuming more of that, and then really decreasing some of the more risk foods. And it doesn't have to be black or white, yes or no, but the reason that I care so much, and when we talk about things like reducing meat, reducing dairy, reducing eggs, seafood, poultry, keeping the fat content low, keeping the cholesterol low, keeping the trans fatty acids low, keeping the heme iron, the animal protein, and all of those kind of bioaccumulated environmental residues or persistent chemicals, really. And the reason I'm so, I don't want to be black and white because it's hard for people to think in that way. But the Adventist Health Studies, huge passion of mine, obviously why I came to Loma Linda, is because we really see a stepwise increase for most cancers, increasing the risk in the amount of food of animal source that people consume. And it's not just even for cancer, it's for type 2 diabetes, it's for cardiovascular disease, even a lot of mental health. And they just have this wonderful research that just consistently shows this stepwise increase in risk. And so sure, if you're okay with a moderate risk, maybe you're just going to cut it moderately. But when we're really talking about something that could be so, dramatic in your life, the closer you can, the more you can reduce your risk, probably the better you're going to be. So we do expand this into kind of what should you choose, how many serves per day, but it basically just reiterates what I was just talking about. Your beans and legumes, minimally processed soy, whole grains and pseudo grains, flax seeds, vegetables, fruits, herbs and spices, nuts and seeds, really choosing water as your beverage, and then kind of avoiding all those other things we talked about, keeping the overall fat intake pretty low, probably less than 30%, which is actually pretty moderate when you think about it. A lot of the plant-based doctors dealing with cardiovascular disease are talking more like less than 15 to 10%. So 30 is pretty generous for a lot of people. Keeping it high in fiber, over 30 to 50 grams per day minimum. Having kind of adequate but not excessive protein content. There are some studies showing that even from any kind of animal source, you really have the lowest cancer risk when that protein is less than 10% of the overall caloric intake. Keeping the kind of glycemic index, pretty low to moderate, favoring more lower heat cooking. Because like I said, we don't know about, not every single product has been tested yet for its influence with high heat cooking. And, that's probably going to be your best prevention as one tool from the dietary perspective. Of course, like I said, this falls into many, many, many multifactorial things, but nutrition is kind of my interest. But, combining this with not smoking, not drinking alcohol, regular physical activity, good stress management, and living in the healthiest environment you can, probably, is a good step in the right direction for minimizing your risk of cancer.
The audience listening out there who may be impacted by cancer or personally, or not personally, who may be impacted by cancer individually or their family members and lost hope, what would you say to this person?
It's so hard. And I think that big part of that is that a lot of people don't really understand or really know how to support someone. That in this case, it's not just a physical diagnosis. Like, sure, cancer is a physical thing, but the emotional and psychological kind of component to that is really very rarely addressed. I mean, I could show you the piece of, oh my gosh, the study that I have in front of me that I was kind of trying to look at a little bit while we were talking. The amount of acronyms and letters and crazy things that I learned at medical school that I honestly don't even remember half of them anymore. But, metabolic pathways and in-depth diagrams. I don't even know if I had more than one lecture on the psychological impact of cancer. And I think it's just so sad that we don't even know what to do with that. And I think that's why we find so many people feeling like they've given up. Like, unfortunately, and a lot of this is systemic. It's not a particular doctor's fault, but, we're very pressed a lot of the time, 20, 25 patients per day. To have that time to really delve into what a cancer diagnosis means, rather than being like, oh, yeah, your test results came back. I'm really sorry, but it's cancer. And then leaving the room, which unfortunately is often what happens. It's like, oh, I'm going to refer you to oncology. Like, it's just, it's painful. And family members see this. They see their, the person they care about so much in their life struggling, and they just don't know what to do. So, one of the things that my dad told me when he had cancer and one of his close friends had cancer, one of the things that he said to me when I became a doctor, and he said that his friend had shared this with him and it resonated really well with him, was to never say to someone, I know how you feel, because I don't. I haven't got a clue what you feel like. And even if I'm, say, I don't know, diagnosing someone with a cancer and I've had that cancer, I still don't know what that means for them. And I've really tried to keep that in my mind as I've gone through my career, and it really relates to everything in life, but never to kind of diminish someone, to be like, oh, I know how you feel. This must be tough. Like, I have no idea what this diagnosis means to you. And I think being there, to, instead of saying and kind of talking a lot, say, do you want to talk about it? How are you feeling? And kind of be that sounding board for the person. Try and be what they need rather than what you think you should say. And it's a big thing we're taught. And I remember being in medical school and it was like, tape your mouth shut for 2 minutes. And the first 2 minutes, don't say anything, because it's so easy to dive in like, you should do this and you should do that and we should do this and we should get you to, it's so easy, and you do it out of care. But it's sometimes not interpreted that way, and it can be overwhelming, it can be stressful, it can bring in guilt, it can bring in fear, it can bring in shame, all kinds of things. And I feel like I have to be particularly sensitive because I'm talking about modifiable risk factors, right? So I have to be so careful that I'm not coming across and playing the blame game. Like, oh, if only you exercise and ate plant-based, you wouldn't be in my office. Like, no, that is awful. And that is not the truth. It is just a small component that I like to share because it is a component. But really just listening to the person. Where are you? How can I help you? What do you need? Do you not understand something? Do you understand something? Do you want me to find out more? Do you need, like, asking them how you can be in their life? Now, of course, the hardest part that you're probably aware with, Luke, unfortunately, some people don't want anything to do. They don't want you to be. They want to deal with it in their own way. And I do find that a struggle, especially in my career. Like, I went into medicine to help people get well. It's really hard when someone says, I don't want to do any of that. I don't want to, like, I'm done. I'm out. I'm checking out. And it's really hard. In my job, unfortunately, sometimes we do things like withdrawing care. Like, it's the hardest thing to do as a physician. You're like, no, we're going to fight to the end. And it's like, sometimes the kindest thing is to just do nothing. And it's kind of funny because it swings back to what you were talking about with True North. And again, I'm in no way recommending people forego any kind of medical treatment, just go to True North. As much as I love it, informed choices. But they used to say True North is the greatest place in the world because you sit back and do nothing and the patients get well. So, what would I say to people? I think just trying to be the person you can be. Try not to be too overwhelming unless that's what they want. If they say, I want you to make all my decisions, I want you to tell me everything to do. And I have people like that. And I sit down, I give them my 80-page cancer document and we go through all of it and they're going to do everything. But for me, I think being either their doctor, their friend, their family is, like everything in life, be the person that they need at that time, even if that's not what you think you should be.
I love it, and that really hits home for me, because I remember
So
when my brother actually was diagnosed, and I was just wanted to help, because having all this information and doing the summit, and I just wanted to recommend him to do this, to do that, out of care and out of love, and
yeah.
he actually said that it was just really too much. You got to back off, because I'm just focusing on taking it one step at a time, and I think it's really about, you're right, just really being there for that person, and just knowing that if you need help and you need love, I'm here for you, and it's really leaving it up to that person. And I think, like you said, I mean, circling back to what you said, it's not about reaching to that point, the stage 3, stage 4, when you're given X amount of months to live. It's about what you do prior to actually prevent yourself from actually getting there to that in the first place. And I think that's really the key to lifestyle and a positive mindset, and of course a plant-based diet, hence Plant-Fit Summit. So
Of
well,
course, gotta grab that plant.
indeed.
Eat more plants, people.
Eat more plants, indeed. I normally have an eat plants t-shirt, so normally I would flash that, but unfortunately it's just a black tea for the Plant-Fit Summit. But
I don't have anything in reach either. I know I have a few plant shirts. I have one from your old brand.
Yeah, indeed.
Somewhere.
Well, in that, thank you very much, Renae, Dr. Thomas. Really, as always, 4th year running of a summit, and fourth appearance. Always love you being a part of our summit. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Like, I'm surprised you want me back every year. Every year I'm like, am I going to get an invite? And I do. I'm so excited. I love you. I love all your listeners. Like, I think what you're doing is amazing. It's incredible. It reaches out so far. Luke, I don't know if I told you, last year after the summit, I went to work, and one of the nurses was like, I heard you on the summit last night. Was that you? And I was like, what? So you're out there. You are reaching so many people. And I just think that it's such powerful knowledge. I love all the presenters you get on. Like, it's just such an incredible resource that you're putting out there for people. So I am absolutely honored to be a part of it. I don't really know how I contribute anything at all with these amazing people that you have on. But I really appreciate your support. You've been one of my earliest cheerleaders. And I'm just so grateful to be here and try and help people and share things. And yeah, it's amazing. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.